This story has got off to a suitably atmospheric start. Thanks in part to the presence of a genial, effusive steam locomotive and a temperature this morning in New Zealand's capital city of just 4 degrees, talk of steam trains and steam is on everybody's lips. For this is a very special event, running exactly 100 years later to mark the journey of the famous Parliamentary Special, the first passenger train from Wellington through to Auckland. This train will be drawn by a succession of steam locomotives over most of the 750-kilometre route. And, just like 1908, there are politicians.
But there's been one event that I've been looking forward to all week, and that is the ride on this very special train.
I think there were 44 originally, but I'm not sure how many there are on this one.
The Iron Horse's victory over the last piece of the New Zealand wilderness marked the completion of the nation's main trunk network, and for much of its history, New Zealand Railways has been publicly owned. Following a recent buyback after 15 years of privatisation, government operators Kiwi Rail are collaborating with a federation of railway preservation groups to operate the 2008 Parliamentary Special. Along with other similar heroic enterprises, like pushing the rails across North America, the construction of the North Island Main Trunk Railway gave birth to its very own myths and legends. In 1908, the American Great White Fleet was making a world cruise as a show of strength. Down in Wellington, politicians were eager to take part in the jingoism. But there was a catch. The railway to Auckland, where the Americans would arrive, was not yet completed. Since 1885, several thousand men had been thrown at the task of closing the 200-mile gap between railheads. It had been a daunting task, requiring massive civil engineering to take the line up onto the remote central volcanic plateau, working in all extremes of weather. And now, after 23 years, the railheads were closing in on some of the most difficult terrain yet encountered. The question of how to get the politicians to Auckland now lay with civil engineer Frederick Furkett. "How would it be if I took you all the way by train?" asked Furkett. "Why, I'd give you £1,000 if you'd carry that through," replied the minister, Sir William Hall-Jones. And so was struck one of the most controversial bets in New Zealand history, to be embedded for all time amid anecdote and legend of the Parliamentary Special. Furkett went away to work out how he could pull this one off, and authorities made plans for a special train to carry politicians and dignitaries to go and greet the Americans. The date was Friday the 7th of August 1908. The place, Old Lambton Station, and all the port of Wellington seemed to be out for the send-off.
There was a whirl of bags, umbrellas, holdalls, rugs, sacred top hat cases, packets of sandwiches, hampers of bottles, feathers, whiskers, skirts, coattails. By the time that the train got its full complement of travellers, there were almost 200 people trying to settle down for the night.
At 10:05, the special set off on the 20-hour attempt to get through to Auckland, along an unfinished railway on what some feared was a potentially dangerous journey. Over the next 3 days, the Centennial Special will stop at places of historic interest. Paikokariki was an important staging post on the old Wellington and Manawatu Railway.
It's good to be here to support the local Paikokariki Museum Trust in their efforts.
I'm thrilled today because my great-grandparents, Eliza and Fred Marshall, were here in 1908 and to celebrate the whole centenary is just marvellous.
Just like 100 years ago, the stop is marked by a sense of occasion.
Our night on the parliamentary train abounded in weird experiences. Supper came first, and we were eating ham and chicken and salad when the train stopped at Paikokariki. Here were revels, and girls and men in evening dress peered through panes at fortunate northern trippers.
Commemorating our first train journey entire by rail between Wellington and Auckland in 1908.
The restoration of the old Paikokariki signal box is a timely reminder that railway preservation is as important as any other national heritage activity. And passing the steam engine shed north of the yard is a tangible reminder that but for such dedicated preservation groups, there'd be no restored heritage train available to make this historic journey.
I tried to restore carriages to what they were in the times when they were running originally, and so that my grandchildren and others can see what it's like.
The Fleet Special, as it came to be known, passed through this lower part of the North Island in the hours of darkness. And the train made good time. From opening back in 1886, the Wellington and Manawatu Railway Company had been supplying efficient services up to Longburn, and the coming of the railway brought considerable prosperity along the fertile Manawatu plain. The stop at Waikanai is made to honour the memory of the man who made all this possible. Wee Parata, a Ngāti Toa and Te Atiawa leader, was a prominent local farmer, later turned politician, and he quickly recognised the great good that such a railway would bring to his people. This luminary came up with a highly creative suggestion. Local Maori would allow the railway tracks across family and tribal land so long as all the trains stopped at Waikanai. And so it was to be. When the Fleet Special passed through here in 1908, the good people of Otaki were tucked up in bed. Whether lured by the charisma of a steam train or a wish to be part of history in the making, the popularity of the event is compelling proof that railways and railway culture are fondly recognised in many New Zealanders' lives.
Yeah, I've got a family full of train drivers, and I've got another brother that's a train driver and a signal maintainer and a nephew, so it's a family affair.
Although the Pioneer Special was far bigger, nearly all the carriages on today's train are the same style, giving passengers an idea of how VIPs travelled back in 1908.
The carriages are new, wider than those formerly in use, and the seats can be let down like a deck chair, which could very well be used for sleeping on.
Bringing up the rear, this car, AA 1013, is a real privilege to be on. Believe it or not, but she was actually used on the original Parliamentary Special, and after the ravages of 100 years, is today's only surviving vehicle from the famous train. 1013's restoration to her newfound glory from a rotting hulk has been a 2-year labour of love. The restoration was commissioned by Mainline Steam, and many parts have been built following original blueprints. Following her fall from grace, she served generations of birds as an open-air nesting shelter, and the rebuild has needed much new and refurbished timber. With many small details to attend to, this measured pace of action belies the real race to get her ready in time for the event. Coincidentally, 100 years ago, old 1013 was delivered new from the workshops just a day before her appointment with history.
The train has been restored, the locomotives restored, essentially by volunteer people. It's an enormous tribute, really, to mainline heritage groups in New Zealand and in the North Island.
JA 1271 has been surprising many onlookers during this stage of the journey. A thoroughbred express locomotive with all the mod cons, she was one of the last steam engines ever built in New Zealand and is the newest member of the train. Just after midnight, and into the first hour of that historic Saturday of 1908, the parliamentary special was rapidly covering the last part of the familiar 100-mile run up from Wellington. Those still awake might have realized the significance of the moment. Just ahead lay a wide new horizon, waiting to be crossed.
This was a commitment by the nation to move away from provincial ties and provincial views to having a national view.
At the Longburn terminus, the Manawatu section of the train was detached. And by 1:30, the remaining 11 cars, now with 2 government engines and crews, stood ready at Palmerston North. But not all the famous were together on the train. Governor-General Lord Plunkett had just yesterday arrived in Auckland, refreshed after a peaceful sleep and full English breakfast, on the overnight steamship from New Plymouth. Fielding is a friendly, enthusiastic town about 15 minutes past Palmerston North. And it's here that a locally restored WAB tank engine, a design once popular on the main trunk, takes over for the run up to Taihape. Around 2:30, the parliamentary special neared Marton, where it swung north into the depths of the winter night.
Familiar faces in unfamiliar guise filled the carriages, and strange heaps of rugs and wraps covered stretched-out bodies, which, with the white pillows provided by a paternal government and groans heard during the night, made the interiors of the compartments resemble casualty wards.
What with rugs, foot warmers, light towels, tickets, and the most acceptable cup of tea, the cold, dark hours passed wonderfully quickly.
We pray that the wayfarers would not be crushed as under the heel of a heavy boot by a slide of papa from the great Mangaweka embankment, or be deposited into the abyss below the huge Makahine viaduct.
It was the first major infrastructure job project done in New Zealand, and probably was unmatched until we did the hydropower projects in the 1950s and 60s. And I think what people overlook is the technical difficulties that had to be overcome. This established the quality of New Zealand engineers.
When the lofty Makuhine was completed, at 273 feet, it was the highest viaduct on the main trunk line. Built by the Public Works Department using the Cooperative Labour Scheme, excavations for the project were beset by heavy rains and flooding for several years. And then it took another 2 years to erect before the first train, headed by tiny L507, rolled over the structure in June 1902. During construction, Several men fell to their deaths from viaducts like this. As she heads the last lap of today's run up to Taihape, WAB 794 recalls times when these engines set a cracking pace with trains just like this back in the 1920s. On the old line out of Mangaweka, all trains had to cross the notorious moving hill of Papa. In such unstable country, some passengers on the Parliamentary Special feared this part of the journey. The troublesome hillside route was replaced in the 1970s by a new deviation with some spectacular viaducts. The new line cut 20 minutes off the old route with its tight tunnels and sharp curves. Like many other places which sprang up as the rails penetrated the interior, Taihape was the quintessential railway town, and from 1904, when it became the railhead, a vital staging post in the great assault from the south to push the railway up onto the volcanic plateau. As a tribute to earlier forms of train control along the single line, commemorative tablets are being carried on the locomotives.
I'm not going to swap around with the L's. You keep it all day. You can eat it.
Out of Taihape, KA 942 contributes additional power and purpose as the train confronts the steep climb up to Waiouru. Here, 100 years ago, a southerly front had passed through, and at 5 in the morning, temperatures were below zero.
Tired travellers rubbed the sleep out of their eyes, shook up their foot warmers, and conversation began to flow again, but for a time monosyllabically.
Weird figures unwrapped themselves from the rugs, blankets and pillows and commenced a pilgrimage to the lavatories for their morning wash or shave.
Oh, but it was cold. Our breath was like smoke, and any finger or foot outside rugs grew numb. The panes were coated inside with frost, and outside was white.
Midway in the long train, authorities had optimistically provided a dining car.
200 passengers and just a 16-seat dining car.
Whisky and sandwiches formed the fashionable breakfast on the train, especially when the kitchen range gave out.
The fare in the dining car was good, but what was one car among so many? As usual, the whole 200 wanted breakfast, more or less at the same point of time, and 17 into 1 would not go.
Oh, well, they certainly suffered from the cold because none of the cars were heated. I don't think they had thermals then, but they no doubt dressed up warmly. But we do know that, for example, they had a pillow fight on the way to fill in the time. I think there was a certain amount of warming liquid consumed. It was, as they would say at the time, a jolly adventure.
In the frosty dawn at Waiouru, it was so cold that water to fill the locomotives was partly frozen in the tanks. These days, watering steam engines out on the main line is still a challenge, and it's done with the cooperation of local fire brigades along the route. 100 years before, the logistics of getting a steam train through this remote region had been exercising the considerable talents of Frederick Furquet ever since he'd accepted the famous challenge. Up here, the line under construction by the Public Works Department was on his watch. He'd inherited a medley of little engines, all fussing about on work trains. Getting old, but still useful, and small enough to operate a parliamentary special over light rails. Just the engines he needed to win a wager. Amongst Furquet's retinue of relics, 3 L engines would incredibly survive into the 21st century. In the first week of August 1908, 2 of these engines were at work up the line north of the pioneer town of Oakune. Now, during one of the wettest winters ever recorded on the main trunk, little L509 has come back to Oakune exactly a century since that heroic week in 1908. In 3 days' time, along with another sister, 509 is scheduled to head the parliamentary special, and a specialist team has been brought together here at Oakune to conduct performance tests out on the main line. The engine's return to this pioneer outpost is the result of a lot of hard work by Jason Durry, helped out by a small group of fellow volunteers at the Silverstream Railway near Wellington. 509's pioneering exploits on the main trunk were well documented by the early photographers, and it was her small size which later guaranteed an active retirement on shorter industrial lines. Later in the 20th century, when 509 had become an ancient engine, she was luckily rescued by enthusiasts for an afterlife that would enter a new millennium. In recent years, 509's languished in the shed, but since Kiwi Rail's call for her to pull the parliamentary special, Jason Durry has spent untold hours getting her ready. Unfortunately, the knowledge to repair L engines passed away with long-dead fitters and engineers, and old skills need to be learned. For the mainline tests, Jason and fellow volunteers will be working with professional staff headed by Trevor Bremner, brought out of recent retirement after many years on locomotives.
Good drivers don't use sand.
The radios that are coming up.
We'll find
100 ton here.
The only thing is what sort of contingency we've got in place if we do get stuck. The problem is if we're stuck in the middle of nowhere, we're probably going to have to kill the fire and stuff like that.
On their historic mission, the team's aware they face the unknown.
If something does go dramatically wrong with the locomotive and we're stuck, we're cast in the middle of nowhere, that's what I want to know. Where are we going to get assistance from?
Standard route procedure though.
We're going to have to make a call whether we can.
No! If you're running low water and you've got no access to water.
These are things that happen with steam engines.
The weather's in keeping with the event. Just a century ago, the district was blanketed by a foot of snow. With only 2 days to go before heading the historic special, and after some preliminary tests in the station yard, the next morning, 509 is cleared to make its way towards the main line. It's many years since 509's kind cast their warmth over similar Oakune winter mornings, as the old engine breathes life back into this rarely used railway yard. Ahead, out of Oakune, the main trunk climbs steeply up through the Tongariro National Park to the small station at Horopito, and it's up this grade that the test will be made, with the little engine pulling a van almost twice its own weight. As if in a time warp, the old L is quite out of place beside trendy bars, restaurants and chalets that have sprung up in more recent times to service the ski fields up on Mount Ruapehu, hidden this morning by low cloud. If any of the Silver Stream volunteers ever had any apprehensions about this mission, now is the time for them. After pottering around for several years on a preserved line, suddenly they're plunged into the real thing. In the 1980s, part of the new line was built along an easier formation up through the forest. A major project was the elegant new bridge, built to replace the old Hapu Whenua viaduct. This is one of the most isolated sections on the main trunk. It's around here that the new deviation crisscrosses the original route that Frederick Furquet was so intent to complete in 1908, including the remains of old Tunnel 6, which the little L would once have used. So far, Jason seems confident, but his hopes for the locomotive that he's done so much to bring back to life suffer a setback when they run out of steam. It's an unexpected chance for a picture, but the team still remains hopeful.
First run it's had out going uphill. Like most things, it's probably haven't had enough time to actually do all the testing and bits and pieces that we wanted. So this is just a shakedown run. I'm sure we'll get it sorted out after this. Well, it's pioneering stuff. It's been 100 years since this locomotive's run out on the track here. So it's historic stuff.
By now, the unrelenting grade has become a constant punishment. And to make matters worse, driving rain and sleet are sweeping the region. Up above in the overhead electric wires, there's 25,000 volts, but unharnessed, all that energy is of no help to a boiler that can't make enough steam.
Well, there's a couple of things. One, the fire got a bit too deep. Yeah. So it wasn't burning as brightly as it could do. And the second one, which doesn't help, it's got no brick arch, which helps to burn the gases better and control the heat. Other than that, yeah, we'll get there. All trial and error at this stage.
By now, they should have reached Horopito, but with the unexpected stops to raise steam, they're barely past halfway. And they have new concerns. For an engine that's steaming poorly, there's no shortage of steam in the cab. And now, with all this rain pouring down around them, there's the ultimate irony. Expressed in simple sign language, they're running out of water. There's a water tanker waiting at Horopito, and it's decided to make a cell phone call to get the tanker to drive down the access road by the tracks towards them. While trying to make telephone contact in this remote area, an attempt is made to push ahead with what's left of steam and water and get over the Tainui Viaduct, where they hope to rendezvous with the water tank truck. They've now got through on the phone, but the team's somewhat less comfortable than they were an hour or two ago. And when rescue arrives, it's not what's expected. There's no sign of the water truck, but Kiwi Rail staff have arrived to ensure it's safe to work under the overhead power lines. And when Trevor asks about his precious water, he's told by Max from the fire brigade that they need to do this recce first with the ute to see if they can drive their big articulated tanker along the access road. Max is now fairly certain that he can get the tanker down here, and in preparation for watering, Averill from Kiwi Rail prepares an earth strap as an extra safety precaution. This is the easiest part of the operation. With the water level in the L quickly falling, Trevor may have to put out the fire, and the big question still lingers: how far away is the water? Averill has some bad news. By his reckoning, the tanker may still be 15 minutes away. They must get to Horopito to let a freight train through, and the possibility of being stranded on this busy main line is a frightening scenario. Now, a last-minute search among supplies in the van unexpectedly pays off. Ably assisted by this very wet winter, it's a beautiful solution. And what happens in the next few minutes is straight out of the Titfield's Thunderbolt. All involved should be patting themselves on the back. Frustrated before the arrival of the water truck, they quickly resorted to primitive means that would have done the pioneers proud. And the day's been saved. Now, if only that water pump would start. Experience with the L in this unexpected crisis offers an insight into what undoubtedly happened on a much wider scale in this region in all kinds of circumstances during the epic push to complete the main trunk railway a century ago. All those anecdotes that went unrecorded with the navvies to their graves. Now the crisis is over, real time and scale return. What seemed to stretch back 100 miles and 100 years has in reality only been a few kilometres on a single wet morning. The venture into pioneer railwaying, where few dare to tread, has been a salutary lesson.
Well, that was a close call, wasn't it? Oh, we got there. How much water was left there before we started putting no water? No. Some of that is really, really real. Absolutely, mate. Yeah, no, it's time, man. See how the boat down the old day. Now, that was a close call.
Now, back at Oakune, another historic moment. During the morning's drama, Sister L507 has arrived by road from Auckland's Museum of Transport and Technology. They might be little engines with little bunkers, but the coal's always heavy, And there's just one way to load these engines, and that's the way they did it a century ago. With only a day before they're due to pull the parliamentary special, 507 and 509 are paired on a test train of milk tank wagons up to Horopito. After yesterday's experience and not wishing to take any more risks, Max and his team have been ready for them up by the Taionui Viaduct. Already, in just a day, Trevor and his team have learned a lot, especially about firing their little ancient steeds. But they wish there'd been more time to overcome the steaming problems. As they set off for Horopito, the two ancient engines tugging their modern state-of-the-art load must be the most unusual-looking train ever encountered by inhabitants during the long history of the main trunk railway. How these little engines will perform on the big day remains to be seen. But for the privileged few who've been involved in these tests far away from the public gaze in the back country, it's been a special experience that they won't easily forget. Following an 80-minute struggle up onto the volcanic plateau from Taihape, the parliamentary special got to Waiouru as day was breaking. Many of the train's passengers had never been in this part of New Zealand before.
We saw Ruapehu rearing his great, cold, snow-clothed shoulders above the frosted tussock uplands. A little later, upon rounding one of the upland curves, we found the cold, metallic snows of dawn transmuted to living gold.
Ahead at Oakuni, the two intrepid volunteer teams and their charges are about as ready as they ever will be.
You're either in it or we're trying to get out.
Although he's hard up against it, in the spirit of the occasion, Trevor finds time to clarify a curious piece of steam-era trivia.
We always traditionally wore a black shirt, which makes sense. One day somebody said something about the dust going down their neck, and the wife suggested put a tie on, and they thought to make it look smart, make it a white tie. So a lot of the old guys did. Started wearing white ties. I'll fill a little one for you, sitting your big fella.
Even the two little L's seem impatient to be on the way. And like all great shows on opening night before the curtain goes up, even the hardest troopers on the team could be excused for getting the jitters. Down at the station, the crowd's building, but no one would be standing here in this moment in time without the untiring work of a few unsung individuals.
Probably a good chance that it wouldn't be here if I didn't step in and get things moving. End of the day, it's going to be over, so but no, it's definitely been worth all the years of work and late nights and early starts in the morning.
A few touch and go moments there. Will it be ready? Won't it be ready? But we're here. This thing.
I will feel a lot better at 5 o'clock this evening. I've got a pint of beer in my hand and it's all over, mate.
Trevor still wishes they'd had more time for testing, but all the same, he's impressed by the high standard of restoration of the L's.
It's been a sterling effort on these guys' part, and someone somewhere has to put their hand up and say a big thank you to these guys. And I think if railways get behind these people and encourage them and put them out in the eye of the public, use them as an advertising tool for the great thing that railways actually is.
As the original parliamentary special neared Oakuni, all its passengers were by now well awake.
By their luggage it was possible to know them all, men and women, and the purpose of the picnic. Fleet bulged from bag and dress basket, hat boxes and suitcases.
Waihuru was passed shortly after 5 minutes to 7, or 50 minutes late, but excellent time was made after this, and at Oakuni half an hour of lost time had been recovered.
Unlike 100 years later, not many pictures were taken of the old parliamentary special. Photography was expensive and largely the domain of a select few professionals with studios in the larger towns. One of these men snapped Sir Joseph and Lady Ward soon after arrival at Oakuni.
At 20 minutes to 8, the passengers were alongside the station at Oakune, from whence the most interesting portion of the journey was to commence, this being the starting point of the new portion of the line so far opened for regular traffic.
After the rails reached here from the south late in 1907, for a time Oakune became a busy, bustling junction on an overland trek which could take up to 3 days. Here, tired passengers exchanged train for horse and coach over the rugged 16-mile service road up to the northern railhead at Waimarino, an archetypal outpost straight out of the Wild West. After some shunting, KA 942 positions the two Ls from Oakune up to Horopito, from where they'll head the parliamentary special. This is a sight never seen before. Dwarfed by the bulk of the KA, two of the smallest, with one of the biggest engines ever to work on the main trunk line. It's been observed that the fascination with steam engines is because they possess human, lifelike characteristics. If so, right now the little L507 at the rear of the train must be experiencing some vivid feelings of déjà vu. Just 100 years and 90 days before, over the valley at the north side of the first Hapua Whenua viaduct, Frederick Furquet photographed this very same engine, drawing the first train across the structure in the same direction on the 9th of May, 1908. Key to Furquet's plan, it looked hopeful that the 5 viaducts now building north of Oakuni would be finished in time. Although Furquet's immediate problem was getting cuttings excavated sufficiently so that they wouldn't scrape the new wide carriages on the VIP special. Greatest of all structures, the mighty Makatote was 860 feet long and a dizzying 270 feet above the gully. Built of 2,200 tons of materials, all brought in by horse teams, its completion on the 10th of July 1908 was a major breakthrough. In the ensuing weeks, excitement grew as the long-awaited event drew nearer. And on Monday, the 3rd of August 1908, the rails finally joined on the Manganui Oteao Viaduct.
For weary years, the North Island main trunk has been a two-headed monster, but yesterday the two heads were knocked together so that parliamentarians may see stars and stripes in plenty. There's now an unbroken steel road between Wellington and Auckland.
The pioneer train did not run through as a matter of course. For weary weeks in workshops and offices, and out in all weathers by the ballast gangs, in the cuttings and by the bridges, men have toiled long, arduous hours. They have been out of the limelight.
Shortly before 8:30, the historic train was nearing Horopito. Ahead lay patches of swampland. Here, Furquet deployed his forces. Vital pawns in his strategy, those small engines being used to build the line, would now propel the train along a temporary light track over undulating marshland up to the Makatote Viaduct. It was over this section of line that Furcutt's wager with the Minister of Public Works, Hall Jones, hung in the balance. Just a humble 4-mile stretch. If anything was going to go wrong, it would be here.
The train crawled at 5 or 6 miles an hour along the unballasted portion, a great snake gingerly feeling its way. Ice along the rails creaked, the naked sleepers seemed to sink into the ground. The passengers got an extra shaking, but no fright.
There was ingenuity, and it was the drive of the Public Works Department engineers at the time that said we're going to get the train through. They just set out to do it. They put down what used to be called fascines logs, scrub, brush, but it was wet, very wet up there at the time, and just laid the track across it. It was, you know, low quality bush tram track, but it got the train across, and that was the goal. It was achieved, and then went back and finished the line properly.
This somewhat hastily laid stretch of track gave out rather alarming groans as the train passed over it, and when one leaned out of the train and looked along the rails, they seemed to be very far from straight.
I don't think it was dangerous in the sense because they moved at virtually walking pace, so if they had come off, they'd just drop in the mud and stop at the bump. The risks were more of a derailment and a delay rather than any danger to passengers.
For the 2 L engines offered life after retirement, now steaming up towards the Makatote Viaduct on their appointment with history, this is their finest hour, albeit a little late in their careers. On the 8th of August 1908, shortly before 9:15, an unknown photographer was on the north side of Makatote Gully. The exposure he made of the parliamentary special on that freezing, sunny morning has become an icon among the recorded legend of a young nation, and deserves a place alongside other great studies of the pioneer frontier taken around the world. Now, the spectacle about to unfold on the grand structure of the Makatote is all set to live up to that famous moment from 100 years ago. The sight of these little L's, which are among few moving forces anywhere on the planet to breathe life through 3 centuries, is a fitting acknowledgement of Frederick Furcutt's inexhaustible energy and his determination to get that first train through, and in so doing, create a legend in New Zealand history. At this time, the Pioneer train was nearly 12 hours into its epic journey. Waimarino would be later renamed National Park, its platform a familiar venue for countless thousands of regular passengers arriving over the years on overnight expresses for winter holidays and skiing up on the mountains.
We helped work on the L507, which just did that particular section of track, and it's just wonderful to see it in action. It's great.
A bonny child of some 13 months was in the arms of the Minister of Justice, and a group of other young children clustered around the honourable gentleman, who had evidently established himself as a firm favourite with the young folks during the few minutes' stay at the station.
Beyond this point, all was easy. We jumped the speed up to 25 miles an hour and sped onward down the quaint spiral to Raurimu.
Today, travel over the Raurimu spiral is just the same it was on the day it opened in 1907. The spiral's famous for its complete circle and 2 tunnels where the railway passes over itself. It's been the subject of delight or bewilderment for generations of travellers, depending on whether they know where to look or not. Rising 700 feet in 7 miles from Raurimu station, the spiral was the ingenious brainchild of Robert Holmes to get the line from the north up onto the volcanic plateau. Working in primitive conditions, most of the labour was manpower. Holmes's survey was so good that nobody's found a better route since. From sunrise at Waihuru, every minute on the fleet special that morning had been crammed with interest. As they descended the spiral off the volcanic plateau to Raurimu, although their adventures were far from over, the route that lay ahead was along a well-established formation, offering the VIPs a comparatively sedate ride for the remainder of the day.
At Raurimu, the populace of the little town turned out en masse to give a hearty greeting to the express as it dashed into the station.
By now, the Pioneer train was past the halfway point, and for tired passengers, it seemed a whole world away from Wellington. But for the less fuddled minds on board, the long-term implications of their expedition were just beginning to be contemplated.
Will this mean a greater Auckland, or will it mean a greater Wellington? A greater New Zealand, I hope.
The main trunk line is going to be the death blow to the old-time cry of north versus south.
Already on the downhill trip from Raurimu to Taumarunui, passengers on the fleet jaunt were beginning to get a foretaste of the kind of development the railway would bring. In the great push south, rails had by now opened up places like Ofanga and Kakahi, and their timber mills were beginning to exploit the vast forests of the King Country. Other travellers foresaw different potential.
Between us and the foothills were forests and deer where other game might thrive, while splendid trout streams, born in the everlasting snows, ran westward to join the mighty Wanganui River. What a paradise it will be one day is now, in fact, for the sportsman, the botanist, the geologist, and the tourist. What a playground for the hardy young New Zealander, and what a resting place for the tired city man or the jaded invalid.
At Taumarunui, Mr. Jennings, the representative of the region, called for 3 cheers in appreciation of the event that was being celebrated, and also for cheers for Sir Joseph and Lady Ward, all of which were heartily given.
It was railways which opened up New Zealand, and it was Taumarunui that went on to be the best-known railway town of them all.
The ubiquitous photographer was of course present during the maiden trip. A set group picture with the men from the ministry was taken at Taumarunui.
But there was no motorcade to greet the celebrities. Nearly 4 years would elapse before the first motorcar chugged along Taumaranui's main street. At Taumaranui, a government engine took the parliamentary special over. Today, the KA will continue to do the honours through to Hamilton. Temperatures hovering around zero, like this morning, were expected as part of the experience of rail travel through the central North Island on overnight expresses. Travellers stretched stiff limbs and fought for service in refreshment rooms, and perhaps it's not surprising that on all the trains that followed in the wake of the parliamentary special, the journey was usually regarded as an ordeal that was curiously embraced in romantic folklore and legends and songs of the main trunk railway.
We have right away, over. We have right away, understood?
The KA 942 was once based at Taumaranui, and on this morning she revives the magic of all her departures from this place over the years. By now, the effects of the freezing overnight haul up from Wellington in the unheated carriages of the Fleet Special were beginning to take their toll. Not a little alcohol had been consumed during the long, dark hours by dignitaries under the guise of a health restorative, meaning extra water stops had to be made to top up the toilets. Further delays were caused by swirling pumice dust stirred up in the new ballast between the rails, making bearings run hot. Yet for all that, the train was not too far behind time as it left Taumaranui. As they headed up the valley to Ongarui into backcountry, which since the coming of the railway was now being broken in for farming and logging, some travellers attempted the noble thing by trying to snatch some sleep.
At all angles, in all postures, on seats and on floor mats, men try to woo gentle sleep, and the majority had their overtures rejected. Heads sagged on tired shoulders, and every now and then somebody looked up to have a laugh at all the others.
As sleep was impossible, some on board might have noticed the new timber town of Ongarui. It was settlers from small places like this who would notice the greatest benefit of rail as they sped along their new smooth steel highway instead of being bogged down on rough muddy roads. And as they crossed over the Waitete Viaduct, many would be surprised to learn that this grand old lady, which had been completed in 1889, would still be around in 100 years' time. Coming down to Tikuiti, the special was now leaving the hill country, which had so dominated today's adventures and caused the railway builders 23 years of troubles. In 1908, local children didn't need time off school to greet the train. It was Saturday. Today, very few photographs survive of the Fleet Special.
Of snapshots, a very large number were taken, and the result should be some interesting mementos of the historic trip. Some ladies too had soft hats and caps to give their heads ease, but others were in the full headdress of war and peace.
We've got the famous wheelbarrow used to open the beginning of the building of the railway through the King's Country at the Puniu. It's housed in our museum. It's a hugely important artefact.
On its tight 20-hour schedule for that first run up to Auckland, the pioneer travellers of 1908 never got this kind of treatment on the way. But they certainly had finer weather.
The train was practically the same as will be running when the line is opened permanently. On the run from Tikuiti to Tiamutu, a distance of 26 miles, Some fast travelling was done, the journey occupying 40 minutes.
The use of steam locomotives on the Centennial train brought back memories of an era which was to dominate operations on the main trunk line for half a century.
Then we set our boilers tickets after 9 months. After 9 months we had to set our boilers tickets so we could look after the steam engines.
The faultless performance of the restored engines was a reminder of the special skills always needed by crews on the footplate.
3 years after that, we had to set a fireman's ticket, which I unduly did. So that was a plus because it wasn't all that easy.
Today, Otorohanga's a farming town. It's in the King Country, where, before the railway was built in 1886, the Pākehā, or white man, feared to tread.
All along the line was to be seen evidence of the interest which the event had aroused among the settlers and workers.
Hello, all you Maoris!
At many of the stations, little crowds were there to cheer.
The story of how Maori allowed the Pākehā to extend the railway south through the King Country, for many years the stronghold of fighting chiefs of Ngāti Maniapoto, has a parallel with Wiparata down in Waikanae. Bitter at the loss of ancestral lands during the wars of the 1860s, local Maori demanded certain conditions. On the 15th of April 1885, on the south bank of the Puniu River, they made their offer. In symbolic gesture, renowned chief Rewi Maniapoto dug a sod of earth and placed it in a wheelbarrow. As he wheeled the barrow, fellow chief Wahanui uttered the famous proviso: "Let the intoxicating liquor, a food that makes men poor, remain on the north side of the Puniu River." And so it was that the rails crossed into the King Country, a region which would remain dry for the next 70 years.
I think it was a commitment by the Maori people within the King Country, which had become very isolated, to actually allow rail to go through and join up and build a modern export-orientated nation. I think that was very important.
Less popularly understood in negotiations between government and Maori leaders was the issue of Maori rebel Te Koti. It was early afternoon as the parliamentary special entered the Waikato district. With just 100 miles now remaining of the epic journey and converging crowds of people, this region to the south of Auckland was beginning to catch the symptoms of what would be known over the next week as fleet fever. On board, there was now no more thought of sleep, as expectations rose as the train approached the Waikato town of Hamilton. In 1908, the station here had for many years been a busy junction to places like Thames and Rotorua. But this was the first time anybody had welcomed a train through from Wellington. These stops were always a good chance to get up really close to a locomotive. The ritual changeover of engines on expresses was all part of the age of steam. Today it's a particularly appropriate occasion because these very same two engines often used to exchange duties here at Hamilton's Frankton Junction. As always, the sight attracts an engrossed audience. G. Cartwright was a long-time Hamilton professional photographer who captured the occasion. Star of the show, the elegant A-compound locomotive, festooned with flags and bunting. W.F. Massey on the platform, leader of the opposition. And Minister of Mines, the Honourable J. McGowan, on the left. And as the shadows lengthened on this faultless winter afternoon, A410 was all set for a clear run to the Queen City. Fleet fever was now rife. Scheduled to arrive in Auckland just 36 hours before the reception of the American Admiral, the pioneer train with its politicians and dignitaries seemed to symbolise the patriotic fervour of a small defenceless colony in need of allies. As well as the restored carriage 1013, there's one other tangible link with the train from 100 years before. Over 50 years later, its importance not appreciated, A410 was cut up, and today it's up to younger sisters of her kind to fly the flag on the reenactment. Although there's little on the photographic record of the old parliamentary special, it's quite the opposite 100 years later. Enthusiasm this afternoon to partake in this historic event, if only over the last hour or so, is as infectious as the earlier politicians' views of the journey in their time.
The initial run right through has been very satisfactory. It is the longest express run ever made in the Dominion, being 28 miles longer than the longest run hitherto.
The trip has been very successful. It's been graced with exceptionally fine weather. We've got through in better time than I expected. We've seen the most magnificent scenery at its best.
It is quite certain that the linking up of the trunk line will mean a very considerable development in traffic, business and settlement.
Now entering Auckland's metropolitan area, although it's a little late for kids to qualify for time off school, the train's continuing to pull the crowds.
The main trunk has now many precious heads on its serpentine body, and how many of them are not aching from the drunkenness of a train rollicking on the rails? Incessant practical jokers and chatterboxes.
Now on the home run with JA 1275, this is the last departure of the train under steam. If Frederick Furkett hadn't won his bet, the VIPs would have had to get to Auckland by other means. But when it eventually ran, the first through train would have been a far less glamorous affair. In the intervening 100 years, there's been much speculation as to whether Furkett ever got his money. Travelling on the train all the way from Wellington over the last 3 days, there's a person who knows. Believe it or not, his son.
For a long time time that hasn't been known, there's been debate. A few months ago I found a telegram sent from Paul Jones to him saying congratulations, well done on your work. The money will be forwarded to you. It was going to be in instalments once you start working to Ned, which was where he was transferred to after leaving Golan. Now, he points out that doesn't actually prove that the money ever was transferred, but that's the best we can do. So I believe it was.
Also on board for the last leg of the parliamentary special, there's another person, the ultimate parliamentarian.
And I'm thrilled that the government of New Zealand is once again the owner of not having to track the rail service so we can make it go in the 21st century.
At last we are here. All that remains of us remains of 200. We naturally were not a handsome brigade when we debouched at Auckland at 6:30, 20 hours and a half on rails. But we had some nice people to meet us. The Governor, Lord Plunkett, the Mayor, Mr. A. Myers, and other gentlemen who seemed glad that we'd not slipped off the Raurimu spiral or tumbled from the Makatote Viaduct.
Auckland had a warm hand for all of us and a pat on the back for everybody. A glance at the busy streets, the greenery, the lights, acted on the weary ones like a gentle touch of electricity. We felt refreshed in spite of concertina clothes and heavy eyes.
Lord Plunkett said that he had not come down to the station to make a speech, but to witness a very important event in the history of New Zealand. He thanked the people for their cordial reception. After loud and hearty cheers, the gathering dispersed.
Aye, it was a rare journey, a grand train ride.